This is our Deaf and Disability Archive session. So I'd like to welcome our Auslan interpreters. Now hang on, Sarah and Sandy, is that right? Yeah. Yay, all right. Who will be just making sure that everyone knows what's going on. This session started out from a committee meeting at the Parramatta conference last year when everyone was talking about diverse worlds and how we were going to have gay and lesbian archives and feminist archives and Indigenous archives, and we were going to cover everyone who was diverse. And as the one stroppy crip in the room, I quietly put my hand up and said, I think you've forgotten someone. Do you think we could cover disabled people? And there was a moment of mystified silence, and then they all went, yes, will you help us organise it? And so Kristen and I have spent the last few months bringing this panel together, and so I hope you really enjoy today. A lot of people in the room today may not be familiar with the concept of the deaf and disabled communities as opposed to a bunch of individuals. And I think one of the good ways to think about it is in some ways we're very similar to the LGBTI community in that most of us don't have parents from within that community. You know, in an ethnic community, you learn about that community from your parents, from your grandparents. For the most part, in the deaf and disability world, we don't do that. And in fact, those communities, like the deaf community, like the short stature community, who do have more of a sort of genetic base, are often our leaders because of that. So in some ways, we can be a little bit behind as far as institutional knowledge. You know, each generation comes at it anew, and often when they finish high school, they hit university and become aware. So, like the LGBTI community, we're also a diverse group of hodgepodge people, you know, LGBTIQ, you know, there's obviously a whole range of people. Deafness and disability is the same. I mean, if you stop and think about it, there's not necessarily a huge amount in common between a deaf person and a blind person, or between, say, a paraplegic and someone with Down syndrome. What we have in common is our shared sense of otherness and our sense of living in a world that isn't necessarily designed for us. And so that's some of the things that people are going to talk about today. We've got three fantastic speakers. I'm going to stop chatting to you now because I'm not the one you're here to listen to. I'm going to start with Sarah Barton, who is, hang on, I have her bio here. She's a filmmaker with 25 years' experience focusing mainly on disability. Her first documentary, Untold Desires, 1994, was about sexuality and disability, and if you get a chance to see it, do. It's fantastic. It won the first Logie Award for SBS television and an AFI award. In 2003, Sarah created and produced the award-winning disability community television series No Limits, which was my first introduction to the disability community, actually, when I was a young'un. And in No Limits, she trained disabled performers, including the late, great comedian and writer Stella Young, who any of you who may know her, a couple of us here do know her, will know she's sorely missed. In 2010, Sarah received a Churchill Fellowship to research a feature documentary about the disability rights movement. The film Defiant Lives premiered at the Sydney Film Festival and is screening at the moment in cinemas through Demand Film. She's going to come and talk to us about that today. Coming up, Sarah.
Hello, hopefully you won't mind, or you might rejoice that I don't do PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk and show you a little clip from my film. That's great. Thank you, Anthea, for that introduction. It gives you a bit of a sense of who I am and where I come from. My experience in... I'll do that in a minute. Yeah, I'll just talk. So my experience in the disability community is not as a disabled person, but as someone who had experience with people that I knew that were disabled and family members. And 25 years ago, I had filmmaking skills and I had an interest. And at that time, I don't think, if you cast your mind back, well, certainly when I cast my mind back to that time, it was really not even something that people would imagine that a disabled person might be a filmmaker. maybe I feel like a little bit ashamed to admit that, because I think now it's very much on the agenda that disabled people should be able to tell their own stories and not depend on someone like me to do so. But I've been doing this for a really long time, and I started making Defiant Lives, well, probably nearly 10 years ago now, and even at that time, you know, the idea was just starting to form that, you know, disabled people could be filmmakers, but I knew that there was a history that urgently needed to be told, and I still had a very strong interest in doing that. So Defiant Lives is really the product of many, many years of a lot of it actually waiting around for funding, I'll be honest, you know. I mean, it's like, you know, it doesn't take 10 years to make this film if you've got a constant flow of funding, but if you're waiting 6 months in between little dribbles of money, then that's why it takes that long. That's the honest truth. But having said that, I mean, it was still a huge amount of work, and I think the thing that brings me here today is that Defiant Lives has over 600 pieces of archive footage in it, and what we had to do with all of that archive was really engage with the disability community as well as the usual sources of archive footage. If we had not engaged with the community, there's no way we could have afforded to make this film, because I'm assuming that most of you being archivists in this room would know that a second of BBC footage to put in a documentary as archive, all rights in perpetuity around the world, is, you know, so, well, I'll give you the 60 minutes US thing. It's $260 a second. So, you know, we did not have that kind of budget to make a film with 600 pieces of archive. So you do depend on community to give you footage, give you the rights to footage, either for a very small cost or for no cost at all. And so yeah, and I think, you know, by the time we finished making, you know, we were on the home straight with some funding from Screen Australia. We certainly had some money, and where it was independent filmmakers who'd shot this footage, we were very keen to make sure that they got not $260 a second, but certainly something to compensate them for allowing us to use their footage. But then there were community organisations who were very, very happy for us to have the footage included in Defiant Lives and, you know, not charge us for it. So that's a little bit of a background about it. I thought maybe I'll show you the trailer for Defiant Lives and you can get a sense of the sort of richness of archive that's in it. It's only a couple of minutes, but because it's a feature documentary, it's 85 minutes long. So hopefully if I press this button, we might have...
I'm tired of all the well-meaning non-cripples determining what I can and cannot do to form my life and my future. Get out of our way.
She was bashing something you ever saw in
Yeah. Oh, yeah. A lot. Nobody wants to live or go into a nursing home.
Are jails for people. They're jails. They're warehouses. They're where America has decided to stick its disabled people and let them rot until they die.
Sooner or later, you have to come up with the proposition that these issues are political.
And I think for many people, it was just the most exciting thing that ever happened to them in their whole lives.
We had this 2-day action where essentially almost everybody just got arrested.
I can tell you, the outrage of disabled individuals across the country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited.
We aren't asking for civil rights, we're demanding them now.
The idea that you can focus on society as the problem rather than impairment or condition is a radical idea.
There's this famous catch crime disability and there's nothing about us without us. When we're involved and included in change, that's when good change happens.
This is about everybody. You're socialised into the assumption that if I become disabled, I don't want to live. That's all very well. When you become disabled, chances are life will seem completely different.
Thank you. So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of, and a huge variety of footage, even just in that trailer. So, and it comes from a huge range of sources. One of the things that I kind of was thinking about when I was coming to talk to you here today was that idea of a community. And because I've been working in disability for 25 years, I've kind of been able to make some observations about the differences between, say, material that's produced by service providers or official kind of organisations like Urella and you know, Scope, and there's lots of different disability organisations that are well funded and they produce a lot of material, and that obviously some of them have some very well looked after archives. But the kind of material that's often made in those organisations often tends to be promotional and doesn't always really reflect true community. It's often got a kind of more corporate agenda, if you like. Sometimes you've got little pockets within those organisations where groups have been able to kind of create their own, they've had the resources to create their own sort of community work, but not always. And I think you need to be really aware of the kind of archive that you can access from those big, quite corporate organisations versus, you know, true grassroots material. And in a way, when I did No Limits for Channel 31, and also a lot of my other films that I've made which are about disability, I've been a part of creating some of that documented sort of community development that's happened over the last 20 years. And one of the things that I've started to do quite recently is to make back issues of No Limits available for the community for sale, basically, so that we can generate more projects. So I've been able to do that by creating an online site where people can watch a whole lot of material, because we've got, you know, 200 episodes of No Limits, so there's a lot of it and people actually want to see it. So we've got about, maybe not quite half of it uploaded at the moment on a site called disabilitybusters.com, which is a bit of a plug, but sorry about that. But the other thing that I did when I was looking, so part of what, sorry, I'm just digressing a little bit here. Part of what I did when I was creating Defiant Lives was to actually mine my own archives, because, you know, with 25 years worth of filmmaking, there was a lot of material that I had and that I had the rights to. And also I had been going out with activists on and off over the years to capture sort of events like the NDIS rally and a tram protest that we ran and that sort of thing. So I'd been involved and I'd been shooting things, not shooting massive amounts, but enough to kind of have a bit of an archive worth mining myself. And also I happen to have a daughter who has cerebral palsy, and there's a few home movies that there's about 6 shots of her doing various things throughout her life, which is like, do you mind? And even she hasn't picked all the shots of herself yet in it, because they're quite quick and they're quite well disguised. But the other thing that I found when I went looking in America, and it actually was quite difficult to find, I spent a lot of time trying to find who had the archive for ADAPT, which is a huge, quite well-organised activist organisation in America. It started off in the 1980s and it stood for Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transport. And then when they got accessible public transport in America, they moved on to trying to get disabled people out of nursing homes. And so the ADAPT thing just became a kind of word. But I knew from meeting, on my Churchill Fellowship, I went around the world and I interviewed a lot of activists, and it was such a big job to go and do these interviews that I made inquiries about archives, but I didn't really set about collecting any on that trip. But people told me there's an archive of ADAPT footage, someone's got it. And it took me years and years to find out who had it. And of course, because it was an old archive that, you know, someone had put together a couple of decades ago, the person who had the footage wasn't on Facebook and wasn't on Twitter and wasn't, you know, easily available. So, and people in America don't answer email. So it was actually quite tricky to track this guy down. I think I had to ring him in Minnesota. And I ended up going to Minnesota in February of the year before last, and spending, you know, a week, which wasn't enough, to look through his 700 hours of archive and try and get some of it, you know, for the film. And we'd done a deal with him where we paid a flat rate and we could use as much as we wanted from his archive, which incidentally was all shot on kind of VHS video and was really, you know, a lot of it was very poor quality. So what it lacked in quality, it made up for in quantity, which of course made our job quite hard because sifting through. And he had a way of sort of limping around at protests with his camera, you know, so that the footage would all be kind of quite wobbly. But we managed to get, you know, some good stuff out of it because he was right there and then when things were happening. And the other thing that he'd done, and this is another thing that was quite interesting about making Defiant Lives, Adapt as an organisation had every night when they went out on protests, they would get coverage in the evening news, and a lot of cable TV channels in America would run like a local story about an Adapt action, which would be, they had actions all around the country. And the activists would go back to their hotel room in the evening and they would record on VHS tape the evening news. And so they had these kind of compiled tapes of evening news stories going back to kind of 1983 on VHS tape. And in NTSC VHS, which is even worse than ours. And so what we had were these compiled tapes of these fantastic stories. They were well shot, they were presented by newsreaders and everything. And sometimes they would have top and tails and we would do this detective work, like which cable channel is that comes from, so we could go and try and get the rights for it. And then you would find that cable channel had been absorbed by another cable channel somewhere else and you had to contact this person. And we started contacting these cable channels and it turned out that they'd all destroyed all archives, so all we could get was what we had. So we couldn't get master tapes because they didn't exist anymore. And half the time the channels would look at it and go, well, we don't even know if that's ours. So, like, you know, we can't give you the rights, we can't sign an agreement, and we can't charge you because we don't know if it's ours or not. So there's a lot of stuff that we've used in there it was impossible, A, to get master copies, and B, it was impossible to discern who owned the footage. And the other tricky thing that we did with there was one piece in the film where a presenter does a piece to camera, a news presenter, and he you know, the piece that he's doing to camera is actually a fantastic piece of exposition in the film that gets us from one point to the other. And it's really important for us narratively to be able to use this presenter. And we go back to the cable channel where he worked in 1994 because, you know, like we were able to search that up, you know, because he had his name on it, whatever. And the cable channel were like, well, we can give you the rights to the footage, but we can't really give you the rights to him because we can't do that. And I was like, oh, this is really annoying, you know. But it turned out that this guy was still working for, like, I don't know, CBS or something, and he had a Twitter account. So I tweeted him and asked him if he would mind, and he was like, no, I don't. He got back to me in like 10 minutes. He's like, no, I don't mind. And we went, okay, we'll just use it, you know, like... So there was a lot of detective work and a lot of, I mean, it wasn't just community. There were layers and layers of places where we were drawing from to kind of pull together a story that's largely told in archive. I just want to tell you another sort of funny story about searching through social media, because in fact, what I think has happened in the time that I've made, I don't think Defiant Lives is a film that could possibly have been made 10 years ago. And the reason for that, even though it's a film that's completely about history, it's not about now, and it doesn't document the actual interconnectedness of disability activists through social media, which is a really fundamental change in the activism story. But in terms of your interest in archives, I actually think that there's been some fundamental change with social media that I think you need to think about and be aware of, is that we are sharing things and we are connected in ways that we never were. And so that opens up opportunities to find things that were unfindable before. In something like the disability community uses social media a lot because a lot of people really can't be connected, you know, in the real world. It's often difficult to get out of home, or it's often difficult to get out and about. So in the disability community, social media is really strong, and if you can get into that community, you can actually access things that you would never have been able to access 10 years ago. We see that on YouTube, where there's loads and loads of stuff up on YouTube. Now, YouTube is a terrible trap, and it's also really fabulous. So it's fabulous because you can type in anything you need and you'll find it, but you won't necessarily find who owns it. So if you want to use it in a proper film where you have to clear copyright, I mean, everything in our film, every one of those 600 pieces of archive, apart from the ones we didn't clear, are cleared. Every one of them has a detective story that goes with it. So if they weren't cleared, then we certainly went through a journey attempting to clear them. And it was a massive, massive job. And YouTube will be your worst enemy because YouTube is full of stuff that the person who uploaded it does not own and does not have the rights to, and often doesn't know who has the rights to, or hasn't looked at their YouTube channel for ages, or you can't so you can spend a lot of time trying to track the provenance and the copyright owner of stuff you find on YouTube. Beware of that. But the flip side is you can find it, which is great. And of course, if you're dogged and determined and connected enough, you can find who owns it and you can get the rights to use some fantastic stuff. I just want to tell you, I've sort of talked for quite a while, but I just want to tell you another story about getting a piece of footage, and this is getting the rabbit holes that you can go down, or that we went down with this film. There was a wonderful image, which I thought was in the trailer, but it's actually not, and it's a black and white photograph of a man doing a handstand, and it's in the opening moments of the film. And as we sort of zoom out to the photo, we see that he's a man, he's naked and he has no legs. And it's just a great, stunning image. And we found it, of course, on the internet, and source material, no knowledge of who took it. After a lot of detective work, and this image would come up over and over and over with all these searches, and it would always come out without the photographer's name. And eventually, after quite a long time, we tracked down a website which was owned by an elderly art historian in his 80s called Edward Lucy Smith in the UK, and he had the image on his site, and it appeared that he had taken the photograph. And so we thought, at last, it was like a triumph. We found the photographer. But of course, the website hadn't been updated since 2007, and he didn't answer any of his emails, and he was in the UK, and we didn't know his phone number or anything. He was retired from whatever university he'd been at, but he had a Twitter account, which he occasionally used. He was 83. He's still alive. He still tweets. So we tweeted him. I'm not in the habit of tweeting people, but we tweeted him, can we use your photo? And it took weeks and weeks and weeks for him to finally respond to our tweet. It's amazing the stuff you can do. He responded, and we established an email conversation, and he said, yes, send me the image, and I'm sure it'll be fine to use it. Just send me it so I can find the original, blah, blah, blah. When we sent it to him, he goes, oh, not mine. I was like, oh, weeks and weeks. Meanwhile, the film is edging closer and closer to picture lock-off, and so the photo comes out because we can't find who owns it, and I'm heartbroken because it's a great photo. And then I sort of think, oh, look, I just have one more go at this. So I put the photo up as a public post on Facebook, and I said, does anyone know who took this photo? We thought it was Edward Lucy Smith, but it's not. Can anyone help, please? We'd love to get the permission to use it in the film. And I had an answer. I had the photographer's name in 90 seconds. So someone had seen the post. I don't know who they were. They were a photographic researcher. She just, I don't know, did a couple of clicks, I don't know, and gave me the name of the photographer. He took 3 weeks to answer my email, but, now we're friends on Facebook, So social, these are just examples, I suppose, entertaining examples of how much has changed and how the sharing of information, especially informally, has really exploded and will enable projects like Defiant Lives to be made that seriously could not have been made 10 years ago, even though they're history. So I think you need to be really aware of the potential of this, world sharing of information. And for my money, the archive that I've got, as much as I possibly can, I'd like to get it up online so people can at least look at it, and they can pay for it too, because for me as a filmmaker, I depend on revenue from my work to survive, very modestly sometimes, but, and obviously there are times when people just want to watch it, and that's fine. And if they want to use it in other work, then, I'm not going to charge them $260 a second. So that was 60 minutes. So I'm about to wrap up, but I just want to look at my notes, because I haven't, and just see the other things that I wanted to talk to you about. Access. I do just want to bring it back to access, finally, because one of the things that I was aware, for me, access isn't such a big deal, aside from the fact that if the font's too small, I can't read it. because I'm old. But access isn't such a big issue. But for many people, you know, captions are needed, audio description is needed, even just sort of physical access, and things like, especially with video archives, old formats. So we had, every video format known to man in Defiant Lives, and luckily my editor is a really nerdy type who was running around to auctions at Channel 9 and Channel 7 and buying up old SP Betacam machines and other machines that would play back these things as a hobby, you know. But that was my benefit, that he was able, that he had those machines. I now have some of them in my house too. They're very big. But you know, you've got to think in terms of just the access of, like, you can find, oh, wow, I've got this tape, this 1-inch tape, great. How do I play it? Who's got a machine that can play it when the machine is like the size of a small room, you know? So that's a sort of access issue too, you know, together with finding, you know, actually for someone, say, in a wheelchair, being able to get into that room to play back that tape on that machine. So there's a lot to sort of tease out in terms of access, not only from, you know, sharing the information with, at the bare minimum captions, and captions take time to put on video. Like there's time and money involved in captioning material that way back was not captioned. And then if you want to go further in sort of, you know, making your footage accessible, there are a lot of things to consider in terms of, you know, audio description and other ways that people with disabilities might need to access that material. So I hope I haven't rambled too much, but I will stop and we'll have a chat about questions and other stuff soon. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Now, we're going to have a roundtable discussion after everyone's spoken, so if you've got a question for Sarah, hold it. We will get to you. But right now we're going to rocket on along to Jess Kapuscinski-Evans, who's a good friend of mine, and who was, until recently, the Disabilities Officer of the University of Melbourne Student Union, so she knows her way around here much better than I do. She now works as an independent theatre producer and is the lead singer of the all-disabled Crip folk band, the Bear Brass Asylum Orchestra. I also happen to play drums in the band, I should admit. And we have the somewhat dubious distinction of being the only band in the world to be more highly medicated than the Rolling Stones. The film clip to Jess's song Welcome won the 2014 Focus on Ability Short Film Festival, and I was going to leave it there, except that Sarah mentioned that when she started working in disability, the idea that a disabled person would want to make a film about the disabled community was something that people didn't consider. When we won the Focus on Ability Short Film Festival, Focus on Ability, it's a disabled short film festival, our director went up to receive our award, and he's a wheelchair user. He went to the Disabled Film Festival. He couldn't get up to the red carpet because it was on steps. Oh. He couldn't get onto the stage to make his thank you speech because it wasn't in an accessible theatre, and they didn't even bother to get a microphone down to where he was, so he couldn't make a speech at all. So if you think, when Sarah says disabled people aren't expected to, and this was 2014, if you think that disabled people aren't expected to make films about ourselves, it's still alive and true, and the film that Jess's song features in very much did that. So, welcome to the stage, Jess Kapuscinski-Evans.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, good. Always check microphones. Yes, I'm trying not to kill my laptop. Can everyone see my face over my laptop? Good. Cool. All right, so I'll start with a little bit sort of follow on from what Sarah was talking about. When I was working at the Student Union, one of our compulsory tasks, no matter whether we were queer, Indigenous, whatever, was to contribute to the union archive. And so in that, when we were putting together the disability segment, we tried to make sure that there were things in different formats, so print, video, pictures, all kinds of things, and basically trying to be accessible to a range of people with different disabilities, because for those of you not too familiar with disability stuff, the disability community is huge. So we are, officially at least, people who are deaf, people who have mental illness, people with autism and Asperger's, things like this, you know, plus the usual suspects like blindies and people with intellectual disabilities, and I've probably forgotten a whole bunch. But I want everyone to go and look up the Disability Discrimination Act definition of disability, because it kind of saved my life when I was a youngster. In terms of helping me to think about stuff. The other thing I'd mention about social media is that it's disability friendly in terms of the technology, in the sense that we have things like screen readers for blind people, we have voice recognition software for people who can't use their hands. So social media presents is accessible to a great many people with disabilities because of the technology that it exists on. Cool, so I guess I thought, I'm not going to be talking about my theatre and the band today because I wasn't sure how to link it to archiving, sadly. But please look up Bear Brass Asylum Orchestra and the Waiting Room Arts Company, which is my new baby, which is sort of a mixture of arts and a mixture of disability. Yeah. So I'll chat a little bit about Melbourne Uni, which is, and I guess some of my experience of records. So at Melbourne Uni once there was an incident where they couldn't guarantee that any medical information provided to them by students would be confidential. So whenever you rocked up to the Disability Liaison Unit to ask for adjustments to assessments and things, you had to actually be very precise about what information you gave to them in the first place. And that was a bit crap. And then in terms of my own personal experiences, I guess signatures are a really basic but sort of ongoing issue. So I can't use my hands. So either someone has to sign on my behalf, or very occasionally these days I still sign with a pen in my teeth, although not highly recommended. And yeah, and then there are other things like, you know, stamp signatures. But basically, you know, I've had experiences in the past where people wouldn't let someone sign on my behalf. And it's like, well, I can't sign, they can't sign. What are we supposed to do? And then also things like too much documenting of my life. That's been a constant sort of theme. You know, so when I have a support worker work with me, we have to document when I drive somewhere, when I take medications, all kinds of things that have kind of somewhat justifiable reasons, but actually amount to what I would consider a bit of an invasion of privacy. So, you know, all this documentation, it goes to the support worker agency, and I don't know, maybe no one's going to look at it, but it's kind of, it seems unnecessary, I guess. And a lot of people with disabilities have this kind of experience. And then, so my favourite thing, which is CRIP history, disability history, which Sarah obviously went a bit into, but what I want to go into is specifically the fact that a lot of lives of people with disabilities are not documented. So my favourite example is that there was a memorial held, I think, a few years ago for victims of abuse in institutions who were all disabled, but we actually don't know the names of those people, and we don't even necessarily know where they're buried. It's all a bit very dubious. And then recently we had a play, The Real and Imagined History of the Elephant Man, And I don't know if anyone's seen that movie, but so the Elephant Man was a guy with facial deformities, and he spent some of his life working as a freak, but a lot of his life living in a hospital situation. And the only reason we know his story is because it was written down by a non-disabled person who was, I think, his doctor. And that's something that we see all too often, is that if we know about the lives of disability, it's not from people themselves, it's from their parents or their support workers or something. So that kind of needs to change in terms of thinking about archiving in the future. I know I'm talking about a lot of bleak stuff, but I feel like it's really important. And then the final thing is that in today's society, what we find is that a lot of people with disabilities don't sufficiently consent to their stories being shared, especially children. Like parents will post sort of quite intimate details about their children and photos that are quite graphic on social media, and then obviously the child hasn't given consent. But even with adults, like a friend of mine that I know, she was very surprised to find a photo of herself used in a sort of publicity thing for an organisation, and she was like, well, I didn't agree to that, and that wasn't incredibly, graphic, but it's still, it's this thing of that if that were a non-disabled person, all of the proper, paperwork and whatever would be done. So, yeah, I guess I'm going to sort of leave you with this idea of thinking about how to make archives in the future, because that's my passion. History is sort of like my hobby, so I want years from now for there to be this really rich and diverse disability history that we can all tap into, whether we're disabled people or not. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm now going to introduce Julian Walsh. I'm really excited to have Julian with us because, as I mentioned before, the deaf community are often our leaders in a lot of ways as a cultural and linguistic group. And so when I was asked to put together this panel, the first thing I did was I wanted someone from VicDeaf's archives, and we got someone. So I'm so excited to have Julian here. Julian Walsh is a deaf filmmaker and a volunteer archivist for VicDeaf, a non-profit organisation. Deaf since 18 months old, Julian became interested in 8mm filmmaking. We've got a lot of filmmakers here today. I didn't realise that at the time, but it's awesome. In 8mm filmmaking when he was a teenager in the 1960s, making amateur films on weekends, and joined the Deaf Film Society, where they would film deaf actors performing dramas in Auslan, that's Australian Sign Language. And these films were then displayed and deaf clubs would attend and watch them. Through the years, Julian has filmed numerous interstate deaf football matches, Australian Deaf Games and the 2005 Deaf Olympic Games here in Melbourne. Julian now volunteers at VicDeaf, archiving deaf history videos and updating the VicDeaf History Archive. Welcome, Julian. Oh, and Julian can't hear you welcoming, so please, welcome Julian.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julian Walsh. And as mentioned, I volunteer at VicDeaf, a not-for-profit organisation. And I am a deaf filmmaker. I have volunteered to make films for the Deaf Society for many years. And as mentioned, I was deaf at 18 months of age, and I became interested in filmmaking when I was a teenager. And I then joined the Deaf Film Society, where we would film deaf theatre. And we would show those films in halls and clubs where deaf people would go along, and if they hadn't seen the theatre show, they'd be able to watch the film in their hall. So that's something I did, and I would also travel interstate and film sporting events, the Australian Deaf Games, the 2005 Deaf Olympics that was held in Melbourne. So digitising deaf history. We received a grant in 2013 from the Public Records Office of Victoria and Museums Australia, Victoria. The purpose was to ensure that we would be able to maintain our historical archives for the future generations. So that included photographs, newsletters, files and videos. Just for your information, we use a capital D DEF when referring to ourselves because we're proud of our culture and we're proud of our language. And our language is called Auslan. An interesting fact is that Auslan is not yet recognised as an official language by the Australian government. In other countries, such as New Zealand, their sign language, NZSL, is recognised. So what do I do at VicDeaf? I digitise the videos, the films into digital archives, and I also put them onto the YouTube account and Facebook. So that ensures that all deaf people around the world can have a look at these videos and enjoy them. So the films that you're about to see were collected by VicDeaf and community members. Sometimes deaf people would ask film crews to come along and record the deaf event. That'd be a deaf fete or a show or a sporting event. In the 1920s, 2-minute deaf news segments were featured at cinemas. And you can see through the films deaf people spelling, finger spelling. Now that's how they used to sign, but now it's changed quite a lot. So you can see the evolution of our language. So here we are. The first deaf mission was a building in Flinders Street in Melbourne. It was bought in 1903. This is the building of the first deaf mission. It was a school, a library, and a meeting place for deaf people, a club. They also bought land in Blackburn. This is the Blackburn buildings. There was also a lake and a flower farm, and these were boarding houses for deaf people. So they're basically boarding rooms. Lots of people went to visit the Blackburn area and would meet deaf people, have fetes, parties, play sports, and the man you can see signing is an interpreter. Here's the lake next to the Blackburn buildings. Here's the lake. So this is a picnic. So people are playing tug of war and having a good time. You can see them finger spelling, as I mentioned. This is quite different to how we sign nowadays. This man who's signing into the hand is Ernest Abraham. He's signing into the hand of a deaf-blind man who can't... So this is called tactile finger spelling. So that man is deaf-blind. Deaf people would usually work on the flower farm. They would grow flowers and sell them to the markets. This is filmed in around 1911. They would take the flowers via wagon and horse to the market. So this is a job for deaf people that was quite common for deaf people to do. So from the houses, the boarding house to the flower farm, there was a lake in the way, and that's where they rode across the lake. This is when the ladies' wing was opened, and deaf people travelled by train to welcome and open the ladies' wing. This is in 1909. The train station is only a short distance from the ladies' wing of the Blackburn Lodge. And you can see the beautiful fashion there. So what we're going to see now is Frederick J. Rose. He is the founder of the Deaf School in Melbourne in 1860. He's an old man now in this film you can see, and he's talking to Ernest Abraham, a welfare officer of the Deaf Society. As you can see, they're finger spelling really quickly. This is how they signed back in the 1920s. F.J. Rose died not long after this film was made. These are the annual competitions. So it'll be an interstate competition between various deaf clubs. This is cricket. These are the organisers and the cricket team. This is a Boxing Day to New Year Day tournament. And this is Melbourne somewhere, we're not sure where. There's a shield that the deaf clubs would compete for. Here are the winners of the match. Lacrosse. Deaf teams would play against regular teams, leagues. So what we say is hearing people. Deaf people would play against hearing people, and we would have news crews come in and film the games and show them on the news. So this is a deaf team playing against Coburg. And this is a man signing. We won 5-3. And these are the deaf ladies that watched the match. In the 1930s, the Deaf Mission bought some other land at Jolimont in East Melbourne. They built a church there, and this is the opening of the church. This is the Governor-General of Victoria, Lord Somers. He opened the church and laid a stone plaque for the church. Here he is giving a presentation. Well, the building's not actually complete, but here is Mr. Abram interpreting for the deaf congregants. And then we have a very prominent minister of Victoria there, and there's Lord Somers opening the church in Jolimont. This is the first church to open in Victoria. Next, we have Ernest Abraham signing the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven. So he's signing it in English, word order. And this film would be shown in various halls and clubs around Victoria, so the deaf people could see how to sign it or what was being said. I won't show you the whole Lord's Prayer. Here's a hymn sung by a deaf ladies group, and they're signing very poetically. This is around 1930. In 1949, this film was made of the Deaf Fete. The Deaf Fete's usually held yearly, and it would be held at Jolimont. As you can see, the cityscape. The church has been built, completed. And this is the fete where people have come to talk. Here's Mr. Reynolds, the interpreter. You could just see him. Cakes, people meeting each other. A year later, in 1950, this is the same fete again. 1 year later, you can see the interpreter there, people watching the interpreter. This is the Geelong branch selling items. A few days later after that, we'd have the Women's Guild organise the Father Christmas and children's games, etc., and Christmas treats. Yeah, they like the lollies. A few days after that, the Australian Deaf Games would be held. So that's where people from Australia, all over Australia, would meet. You can see the church there again. And this is the first day of the Australian Deaf Games. When the people from interstate would visit Melbourne, they would have tours organised for them. Here they are having a tour of Melbourne. I'm not sure where they went exactly, but Luna Park, obviously. Western Australians like to see what Luna Park looks like. Here they are playing tennis at Royal Park. So this is a tennis competition between New South Wales and Queensland. Here are the people gathering at Jolimont. They might play cards, different games there. Here's a cricket match at Royal Park again. Queensland against New South Wales. This man is fingerspelling. He's introducing each person by name. He has a Queensland outfit on. Here's a deaf lady watching the games. This is the Queensland ladies team. and another tour. I think it's around the Bayside to visit the beaches. People would go into the city of Melbourne at Flinders Street Station, and here is the trophy presentation for each state. In 1955, at Jellymont, they built a new hall, a bigger, larger hall. The Governor-General came again, Dallas Brooks, to launch or open the new hall. In 1966, the Victorian deaf football team arrived in Adelaide to play for the Shield. Here's the Victorian team. Here they are all lined up. And this Adelaide TV station came to film this. And you can see instead of blowing a whistle, they wave a white flag. And that's it. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
Wow, that was fantastic. And I think a wonderful way to demonstrate the importance of community archives because, you know, as I think Sarah will know, Melbourne's more generalised disabled community doesn't have anything like that resource. So I'm going to invite everyone up onto the stage now for a little roundtable discussion. One of the things that was sort of hinted at, I think, in all three of the talks, but wasn't really discussed in any sort of detail for those of you who don't understand it, is one of the ways that we understand the concept of disability, and I think, again, the deaf community has probably led this, but it's what we refer to as the social model versus the medical model of disability. And Sarah, I know your film goes into this wildly, so do you want to maybe have a talk about those concepts?
Yes, absolutely, and really that's at the heart of Defiant Lives if you want to come and see it. In cinemas at the moment, defiantlives.com. The social model, you can see where the screenings are. The social model basically came out of the UK it was evolved in the 1970s, and it purports that disability is really caused by the social barriers that prevent people from participating, like that flight of stairs for Jess, for instance, you know, that's disability, not her personal impairment. And so it actually really reframes disability in a way that takes it away from the individual as having some kind of shortcoming to actually the society that's failing to provide access. So it's a really important distinction because it takes it away from the individual and it makes it a collective. Disability is really that barrier, that collection of barriers. And I think once you start to make that shift in your thinking, it's a real paradigm shift and it actually really opens up. It's very liberating. But that's certainly what informs Defiant Lives and all of the work that you guys do and everything. So, yeah.
Sorry. and I think, would I be right in saying, Julian, that the deaf community sees it in a very similar way in that basically if we all spoke Auslan, you'd have a lot more access, you know, and that your deafness would be less of an issue day to day. Would you want to add anything to that? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Many years ago, the deaf community has been using sign language for more than 200 years. And then the medical model came along and oralism was encouraged, so trying to make people use lip reading and speaking. Some people can't lip read. Not everyone can lip read. So technology improved and some people started using hearing aids, and then the cochlear implant was introduced. Some people can't use a cochlear implant because of the way they've lost their hearing. So people now who use cochlear implants have decided to join the deaf community because they really share a common understanding and identity with each other. So Auslan used to be an underground, hidden language. It wasn't shown out there in the community. I'm talking about pre-1950s. And people really didn't know about it until it became more widespread. And in some ways it's almost so, Auslan's almost so, or images of Auslan are almost
so recognisable now that I think some people almost think it's cool. You know, I want to learn Auslan, can you teach me the rude words? Have you had that sort of experience where it's not taken seriously as a language, but more as something that's, you know, trendy?
Yes. Some people do just want to learn sign language for the swear words. And that's okay, but, you know, it's not about looking cool. It is about learning the language. When I catch Uber now, and a lot of people, Uber drivers can sign thank you, which I feel really that they appreciate me and they're happy to have me in their car and they really appreciate the language. So that's a really good positive step.
I also wanted to pick up on some of the things you were saying about signing your name. To be a little bit topical, those of you who have received your survey in the mail will have noticed on the bottom, if you have any trouble filling in this form, ask someone you trust to help you. Now, I think most able-bodied people assume that being able to vote privately is a fundamental right that everyone has, and the truth is in Australia that is not the case. And I think people with all sorts of disabilities, we have to negotiate privacy in different ways. So obviously, Jess, you were talking about not being able to sign for yourself. I'm 40 and my mother still sees me naked fairly regularly. You know, obviously, if you rely on an interpreter, go to a private doctor's or lawyer's appointment. You know, you need to negotiate that, or negotiate with your daughter about her privacy, as you know. So did you want to have a bit of a talk, Jess, about those concepts of privacy? How do we negotiate privacy, and especially in the documents about us as well as our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, it's something I've been fortunate actually not to have too many problems with. The main things I encounter regularly in terms of privacy is things like, you know, if I want to go on a date with somebody, or I want to send lewd messages to somebody, you know, as texts, you know, luckily nowadays there's Siri, except can you imagine Siri saying, I would like to kiss your please? It's not the greatest experience in the world, but it's better than, you know, the alternative. So that's sort of what I find in terms of privacy, but in terms of records and stuff, I guess it's knowing who you trust, that word again, to look at your records. So I have a somewhat stringent process in terms of how I select my support workers. I don't just work with any old person who says that they're free. And that, you know, and in that I'm looking not so much are we going to be best friends forever, but, you know, do I think that this person will, you know, be able to, for example, put a piece of paper on my tray and not sort of go, ooh, what's that? You know, and that kind of thing. So, yeah. Does that answer the question?
It does. And look, I remember even when I was a teenager, because my parents received a carer's pension, legally speaking, when I was a teenager, if I wanted to go over and have a sleepover, they had to ring the government and tell them. Seriously, you know, you want to go stay at your boyfriend or girlfriend's house? Make sure you tell the government first. You have a daughter of about who's going to be dealing with those things shortly. How do you prepare her and prepare as a family, I guess, for those kind of intrusive record-keeping and other issues?
We've decided to put everything off until she finishes year 12. So, no, not sleepovers. She actually very rarely does sleepovers, and that's another issue, I guess. You know, it's not, she doesn't get invited a lot and prefers not to sleep away if she can avoid it. But in terms of paperwork and all of, because my daughter's just turned 18 this year, so that means the actually really difficult thing is when she actually needs or wants me to deal with something on her behalf and I can't, you know. And so we had to get the whole Centrelink sign over. That was such a rigmarole going to I mean, we don't even get it like a pension. It was really just to get the healthcare card, and the rigmarole to get stuff happening, you know, when she turns 18, it's like, like I used to just do it all and now I can't, which is obviously she needs to have a level of control, but the flip side of that is sometimes she just wants me to get stuff done for her, and we just want some efficiency, but no. No. So, yeah, there's the flip side to what Jess was saying, I suppose.
I also find, so I'm 29 and still living at home because of access things, right? And so sometimes I find that even when I'm perfectly confident with dealing with, you know, particular admin or other sort of my affairs, people want to talk to my mother, or like my Centrelink paperwork still comes addressed to my mother, and it's like, oh, anyway, so things to look forward to when I move out.
But I guess those sort of things can actually vary from person to person too. Because, for instance, with my daughter, speaking on the phone, most people aren't going to understand her because her speech is very hard to understand. And so she's just like, Mum, can you deal with it? You know. But at the same time, I need to be respectful that, you know, there is a point at which she needs to, you know, take care of it. So, but it's not really a black and white kind of thing.
No,
it's right. It varies from person to person.
And dare I say that at some point Stella's going to meet someone that's going to make her want to have sleepovers. Julian, how do you find the privacy issue with, say, doctor's appointments, lawyers' appointments, all those things that we take for granted as being private? If you need to use either a paid interpreter or maybe a family member or friend.
When I go to the doctor, I use pen and paper most of the time, or the doctor will use a computer to type questions to me, usually yes-no questions. But if it's very serious, a serious issue, then I'll get an interpreter in. But if it's just a cold or a cough, I'll just use pen and paper. In terms of lawyers, yes, I always have an interpreter there because it's very important information. If it's work-related or a job interview, I have an interpreter there. If I want a promotion at work, I get an interpreter for that. I need interpreters who can understand the way I sign. If I can't get an interpreter, usually I use pen and paper. In terms of privacy, it is private. So for example, I used to play in Australian Deaf teams cricket, and I would have to ask my mother to send off the results to the interstate teams, which felt a bit weird. And so my mother was in fact my interpreter and would use the phone for me. But nowadays it's much better with interpreters. So in terms of privacy, a lot of people don't really know that I'm deaf. I'll be on the bus or the train and I look like everybody else, and someone will come up to talk to me and I'll say, I don't understand you because I'm deaf, and then they'll just go up to the driver and talk to them instead.
Shall we throw some questions open to the floor? Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? We've got one over here. Two in the same row to make your life easier. Yeah, if you can tell your name and where you're from.
Yes,
awesome.
I'm Kate O'Neill from the University of Melbourne. Thank you for such a great session. I was really losing consciousness at the end of the day, but I'm very enlivened now. Thank you. Just an issue that came up in all of your presentations, and I work on a project with people who grew up in children's institutions, and it does include some disability institutions, but not all of them. But there are a lot of parallels and resonances with the advocacy. that nothing about us without us is a phrase that's been taken up in the care leaver space as well. And it's something that it's really great when you're working with other communities to be aware of that idea. The thing I was most interested in seeing Julian's beautiful films, a lot of the past providers of people who ran orphanages, I'm aware that they have amazing collections of films that they made, mainly for fundraising, promotional purposes, but there is a real risk-averse attitude to digitising this material and making it available because it's got pictures of children. And, you know, what about their privacy and did they give consent? And it's a really big issue in the care leaver community, and people want access to photos of themselves as children. And we know these materials are in archives, but they're not being made available. Did Julian, particularly, did you have to deal with those issues of identifying people and people's privacy, or do you just, I mean, did you see it as a good to put it on YouTube?
I've got lots of deaf films of deaf actors and a lot of documents that are on YouTube, a lot. And with privacy, with the Deaf Club, people signing, I've had no problems with that. I don't think it's something we want to hide away. I think it's something we want to show.
That was something I came across with Defiant Lives too, because we were wanting to contact a lot of institutions or charities that had provided, institutional care for disabled children. A lot of them were worried about how they were going to be seen. Some of them were reluctantly dragged into the present time and ready to acknowledge past mistakes and say, okay, we need to own this, which is great when they do that. There was some footage that we used from the UK, which we really tried very hard to work out the provenance of. And I can't remember the exact organisation we got in touch with, but they have this kind of law around orphan footage that can't be identified. We don't use it here and they don't use it in America, but they use the word orphan footage. And you use it at your own risk, and some of that involved disabled children and disabled adults who probably hadn't signed any consent forms, but the adults were clearly consenting to be in the films. But it is a big issue, and it's a shame, really. And yeah, I don't quite know what the solution is, but it would be really good to address because there is a lot of wonderful footage of children, and some of it's not wonderful too. But I think it's really important that it's seen and it's understood, and it would be great to have some protocols around, getting some of that stuff seen. So I think it's a really interesting issue that you raised. I don't know that I've got the exact answers, but it's certainly something that we came across. And getting some of the organisations that own the footage to maybe be less risk averse, maybe to get a group of them together to discuss how do we do this. It's probably not a priority for them, but it might be a priority for us. Yeah.
And of course, for any organisation that's still working with children, there are all sorts of legal implications about revealing people who are currently in care, and so that probably, of course, colours their views about the old footage, even though it's not necessarily covered by those laws. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
I just stole the microphone from Greg, who was going to ask another question to just add...
More the merrier.
Add a comment to that. There's So
can you just give us your name and your...
Joanne Evans from Monash University. There is a learning disability archive project in the UK where it is with the Rick Centre in Open University, a few other universities getting together and actually addressing that question of how the community takes that disability archive, which was done about them, and turns it into the archive for them. And they've done a lot of investigation of sort of consent processes around people with various degrees of learning disabilities. So it's probably an example that could be used to sort of have a look at the kind of protocols coming out of it, and therefore to sort of take that to the next level. So I wanted to just highlight that one.
Yeah, and of course issues of consent for people with intellectual disabilities or people with difficulties communicating can often be a real bucket of worms, you know, and understandably so.
Yeah, I was at a conference where I was presenting on a panel with them, and it was to see that they showed the footage, that newsreel footage from the sort of 40s and 50s, and just the difference it made when you had that context of which it was being presented by the people to which those practices affected. It's like it was it's that issue. You don't want it to be hidden, but you want it to be presented in that kind of way.
I don't know if anyone remembers, Sarah, you might, I think it was about 10 years ago, there were two young men, adult men, with intellectual disabilities coming out of Queensland who made a comedy video show, film or something like that. Do you remember? Yeah. Yes. And there was a huge hoo-ha because people were laughing at them and they had intellectual disabilities. And so they were all over the news saying, we made a comedy. We knew people would laugh with us. Yeah. That's what we're doing, you know. Yeah. But there was this huge assumption made that because they had intellectual disabilities, they didn't have that level of understanding of humour, you know. And so that's where sometimes these top-down laws can be very problematic. Or in this case, they weren't laws; they were just people putting in their 2 cents worth.
Just spoke about surveillance, and there was also talk about having an assumption that your parent does speak for you or cannot speak for you, and that kind of thing. I just wondered if panel members would like to reflect on your access to your records and that surveillance material, and how you negotiate that.
As in medical records, you're talking? Or records generally?
Well, medical, but there's going to be other, Centrelink, other social stuff, educational. Yeah.
Who wants to field that one?
Yeah.
Go for it, Jess.
So I found, I've never had access to my records denied to me. It's more that I think that there's a culture of over surveillance, a culture of policy and procedure sort of invading the lives of people with disabilities and their families. Let's not forget that, for example, if a paid support worker is forbidden by the agency that they work for to give me my medications, then my parents have to do it. So all of these things have a sort of flow-on effect, I suppose. In terms of if I wanted to get access to the paperwork that's submitted to an agency, that's relatively straightforward. So I think it's more, what's a worthwhile record and what really isn't is the question we need to be asking. Yeah.
And I certainly have medical records out there about me that are incorrect, that are wildly incorrect, from doctors making assumptions. I have an illness which is historically difficult to diagnose and disbelieved by a lot of people, despite the fact that I have some florid MRI scans. And so when doctors have disbelieved me or have written, and I've seen them do it right in front of me, type into things that are just wildly incorrect, and I've said to them, and I see it, and they'll nod and yes, and you'll see it stay there on the screen. Now, my reaction when a doctor treats me like that is to never darken their doors again, which is fair enough, but that doesn't mean that those records don't still exist at a rather large hospital that will remain nameless, Monash Medical Institute. But that does mean that if anyone at any point wants to question my competency, those records are there and can be used against me, and I'm aware of that, and I honestly can't tell you how I can get rid of them,
I forgot to say my name's Greg and I'm from Monash University.
I'm also from Monash University.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's okay, I'm allowed to slag yourself.
Yeah, but
I don't work in the medical department.
But the other question, without taking over this thing, is it's one thing to not be denied access, but do you know what records exist and who else has access to those records?
Do any of us? Yeah. In the panel or in the room?
Yeah.
I've worked with, I've been on Centrelink for much of my life, and I'm sure there's a, Does anyone else know does anyone else want to comment on that?
Okay.
Say anything on that matter?
No, sorry, the microphone's being kidnapped from the area there. We've got more questions over here.
Well, we have to go soon.
We're paying interpreters.
Anyway, the government might sort of know everything about our lives and Centrelink, and we feel like we're overknown. But I mean, my stepson told me about the government knowing a lot, and I really don't know. I think there is a lot of surveillance over there. I don't know whether our records are private. I don't know whether, that means that the government can sort of stalk us or follow us up or not. But they do know about everyone.
That's very true.
Hi, I'm Annalie from Monash and Melbourne University.
We're all from Monash here.
So yes, we've kidnapped the mic from over there because I had a burning question, which there just seems to be this tendency to infantilise groups, whether that's the Indigenous community or the care leaver community or the disability community. There seems to almost be this weird presumption that you need people to record your lives, or this, I think Anthea, something that you said before about, the government needing to know about a sleepover. That's just, it strikes a lot of similarities across those groups. Yeah. And I even saw one of my mates has Down syndrome, and she's incredibly intelligent. She's just got a speech impediment. And a lady, she was 25 at the time, and a lady tried to offer her, honey, would you like a lollipop? And she turned to me and she said to me, what the hell's wrong with her? It was just fantastic, but it just seems to be so common. And is there anything that you guys would like to see changed, or any strategies in terms of, even in the archival community, what are those assumptions that we should be challenging amongst ourselves and amongst our colleagues?
The first is that we can speak for ourselves, even if we don't speak the way you speak. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Where do I start? I mean, so in 2017, we're in a situation where people with disabilities are vastly more unemployed than people without disabilities. We often have lower levels of education. There's still problems with, like Sarah was mentioning, the public transport. Still, like, half of the transport in Melbourne I can't access. Is it any wonder that we're infantilised and stuff still happens to us? So I would say that, everyone needs to be an advocate for documenting success stories, but also trying to reach out to individuals and organisations for people to tell just their stories, ordinary lives. I think, like, Sarah's film is Defiant Lives. My passion is ordinary lives. People with disabilities just doing mundane shit that people without disabilities do. Yeah.
We're often told we're very inspirational.
Yeah.
For getting out of bed.
Yeah.
And we're not. Is there anyone else want to ask a question? Yeah.
At the risk of doing another shameless plug here, my film Defiant Lives is really a film that empowers anyone who sees it to actually understand what they can do better in the world of disability. So the idea is that the film's very entertaining and it's got a lot of, you know, great music and footage and all of that sort of stuff. But a bit of nudity, yeah, a tiny bit. Not a lot. Untold Desires has more. But it's also a film where a lot of people come out of seeing it and they go, oh, wow, I can see how I can apply a more accessible sort of ways of working to what I do. So it's about taking some universal ideas about the social model of disability and applying it to your own life. And the film really does give the tools to understand and to begin to think about that. And, you know, it's not just me saying this, but people who've actually seen it. So it's worth, you know, it's a starting point for people to really understand how they can apply access priorities to any kind of walk of life, whether it's a shopkeeper or an archivist or a teacher or whatever. So, yeah, I could do more shameless plugs, but that's probably enough.
All right, I'm going to ask the final question because I have the power. So Julian's talk showed us some wonderful things from the VicDeaf archive. After I contacted the VicDeaf archive, I then went to look for a community archive about disability more generally in Australia because I knew that there were ones in England and America. And as Sarah knows, there isn't one. So this is my next question. Do we need one? And if we do, what form should that take? And should the ASA be involved? Or how should the ASA be involved?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we need one. That's my next advocacy project. And the ASA absolutely should be involved. I mean, sort of what I hinted to about kind of mixed media is the future anyway, even if you don't think about disability. Something which is culturally nuanced. So one thing that I didn't get to talk about is the fact that, like, for example, there's now a group of people with a diagnosis of autism who actually say that, no, we're not disabled because in a previous point in history, we would have been, you know, equal citizens along with everybody else because the certain things that we can't do were actually not mandatory in that place and time. And so there's a lot of stuff like that now emerging in the kind of thought processes of what we call the disability community. So a really rich sort of idea of understandings of disability as well as personal narratives, I think.
And I think that thing you mentioned about people with Asperger's, I think really reflects in the deaf community's idea of deaf, not disabled, or, well, maybe Julian, you'd like to talk about that.
Yes, deaf people don't see themselves as disabled. They see themselves as able-bodied. They don't have that view. And that people look at them through the medical model that they need their ears fixed or their hearing fixed, but that's not how they see themselves. Deaf, they're just a real person, as a deaf person.
I've got to have my turn. I think it would be fabulous to have a disability archive, and I'm going to go from the real practical end of things, is that there's a lot of footage, videotape, film. There's a lot of material, not just the stuff that belongs and lives in the big service providers, but there's actually a lot of community material that is not being well kept, that's being kept in boxes. It's not accessible for people. People don't know what's there. It's limiting the ability to tell stories. And I know some other people who are really interested in trying to get an archive going somehow. So I think it would be really, really fantastic to have ASA involved and to try and make something happen, because this is not the first conversation of this kind I've had recently. So, I think it'd be really fantastic to get one going, and also to employ disabled people to run the archive. Yeah.
And that's a huge thing. Archives are often not particularly accessible. My archive is not particularly accessible. I spend a lot of time saying OH&S, OH&S, OH&S. And so that is, and often when you see job applications. It, must be able to carry and lift and do all of these kind of things, which some disabled people can do, some can't.
And I also want to add, which is half a plug, half a not, but cultural output by people with disabilities. So hypothetically, one of my pie in the sky projects for the future is a Crip Lit subject, so a subject taught to literature students who study novels and poetry and shit, but every text has something to do with disability. But I think where that relates to archiving is that, in the archive I would love there to be not just novels and poems, but music or, things that people with disabilities have actually made. Because I think it's very International Day of People with a Disability, but it's actually true, which is that our achievements need to be documented and celebrated. And, I would not have been part of the disability community if I had not been, so Stella and I were graduates.
That's Stella Young you're talking about?
Yeah, so we were graduates of the Youth Disability Advocacy Service. Social Model Academy is what I like to call it, because, I really learnt about, what it means to have sort of disability pride there. This was when I was 13 and Stella was a bit older. But Stella made this great film called Carbon Whore, and it was funny and clever and hardly any
Sarah was
text.
involved with, weren't you? Did you direct that? No.
But it was a very simple story about a woman who's a wheelchair user and her struggle to be environmentally friendly, and that really changed my life, I would say. So more opportunities for young people with disabilities to see cultural output by people with disabilities is hugely important.
Well, I work in an arts and culture archive, so maybe we need the four of us need to sit down and have a chat at some point. But I don't know about you, but I think this has been a fascinating discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. I'd really like to thank our three fabulous speakers. So if you could put your hands in the air, and big thank you to Jess and Julian and Sarah. And I have some housekeeping before we go, as we do have extra time because there is a minor fault in the program. It says that the Jean White lecture starts at 5. It actually starts at 6 in the atrium. In here? Anyway, so it's at 6, so you have time to have a coffee, have a snack, go to the toilet and have a good hard look at your lives. And then we'll see you all at 6. Thank you so much for joining us.